My name's Alex Stamos. Thanks. Yeah, don't applaud yet. You haven't seen it, so.
Just like the title.
You just like it? Thank you. Yeah, so my name's Alex. I'm currently the CTO of Artemis Internet. I was one of the co-founders of a company called ISEC Partners. Artemis is a sister company to ISEC, doing some R&D stuff. I've spent my entire career working basically to protect global capitalism against people who are trying to break into it, right? So I'm what you would consider an InfoSec sellout in the information security industry, a white hat, a professional hacker on the side of the good guys. Before I started ISEC, I worked at a company called At Stake, which was a company known for having better technical people than Financial Sense. Before that, I was in charge of security at a company called LoudCloud, which was mostly famous for ending the first .com boom with our $6 IPO and $30 stock options. So, and before that, I was at the small public school for poor kids across the bay, where I got to work with Dave Patterson and Dave Wagner and some fantastic guys. I got to meet John Hennessy, and there's a story about being in the woods with him that I can't tell on video. But anyway, today's talk is about Snowden. So everybody in this room is perfectly qualified to understand the Snowden disclosures. I think where I'm going to try to add some benefit for you is I work in the corporate world. On a day-to-day basis, we work with all of the largest internet companies, most of the largest banks in the country, several international institutions that are really worried about this kind of stuff. In fact, this talk I put together, although I have some political interest in talking about this kind of stuff, this was actually a request of 8 of the truly too big to fail banks, things called the financial market utilities, which are the people who actually make all of the money move around the world. Generally, if you Google their names, you'll find lots of black helicopter kind of New World Order theories about them. And they're terrified about this kind of stuff because those are companies that have to operate in lots of countries with very aggressive national security apparati, and they have to maintain trust across everybody, no matter whether or not they're considered an enemy or a friend of any of those countries. And so they asked, what's going on with Snowden? What should we do to protect about it? I put this talk together originally for them and have given it several times. This will be the first time it goes on YouTube. So we'll see whether or not you're watching me douse myself in fire and set my career on fire, douse myself in gasoline. So technically, here's a warning for anybody who has a security clearance. I have a bunch of the slides that Snowden have released, and they haven't technically been declassified, right? So if you have a security clearance, you have a duty of care for classified material. So in theory, you're not supposed to look at the slide deck. I was required to put this in. I gave this talk to a private audience, of which there are about 100 people with classifications in the audience, including a couple guys in BDU sitting in the front seats. Nobody left when I said this, but I was asked to give this warning. Okay, so why should you care about the Snowden stuff? So internet services is one of the things the United States still does really well, right? We're not the world's leading exporter of steel. We're not the world's leading maker of aluminum. Lots of people make cars really well. The Germans believe that they're pretty good, as do the Japanese. You can buy fantastic gas turbines from Rolls-Royce. You can buy commercial airliners from Airbus. There are very few things in which the United States is a totally dominant exporter. And one of the last vestiges of that is software, internet services, and networking equipment, right? So if you're just an American and you don't even care about the tech industry individually, but you care about our economy and the long-term prospects for the United States competitively in the 21st century, then I think you have to care about the Snowden revelations because it's having a real impact. To maintain this competitiveness with the rest of the world, we have to maintain trust. A lot of people are willing to buy products from Cisco and Juniper, and they're willing to use Yahoo and Google and Salesforce because they implicitly trust those companies, and they trust that they operate in a legal framework that provides a balancing act between the needs of the state, the needs of individuals, and the needs of those corporations, right? And it's that high trust society that we live in that has been caused one of the greatest economic booms in U.S. history after World War II. It's that high trust that people believe the legal system is there, that it protects you, that the rules are followed. That is why people invest in the U.S. and they use our products. And there's lots of already scary numbers about what's happened since then. There's an organization that's estimating a $22 billion to $35 billion hit to cloud computing providers over the next 3 years. And Cisco is already blaming missing their Q1 numbers on the fact that their sales in China dropped 20% in 1 month after the Snowden revelations. Turns out, if you're in China, not buying Cisco equipment is actually a pretty smart move. Yes, sir.
Comments at the bottom of the Cisco blog associated with the executive who's covering this?
I haven't read those comments, no. I mean, I'm sure you can interpret it multiple ways, but I have no doubt. Certainly things have been expressed to me personally about people holding off on buying stuff until they figure out what how to handle this kind of stuff. Now, even if you don't care about the NSA as a threat actor to yourself, these revelations are really interesting because they finally provide us with a good level to know what the capabilities are for major nation-state actors, right? So the last best look we got at that was in 2009 with the Chinese with the Aurora attack, which was a very small slice of the capability. Now we know what capabilities you have with physical access, what kind of cryptographic capabilities are out there, what kind of storage capabilities. And so even if you're not worried about the US, if you have any nation state that is possibly a threat actor against you, then this information is very useful. I also have this theory of trickle-down cyber warfare, that we can look at the current state of threat actors who are not nation states, and we could have predicted where they are right now by looking back in the past. So like I said, 2009, the Aurora attacks, I was involved, 35 American companies were hit by the Chinese using ODay malware sent to an individual inside the company, attacks against Active Directory using both cryptographic and ODay means, horizontal movement across the corporate network, and then the takeover of individual laptops of key employees. That kind of technique and technology in 2009 was only starting to get widespread. This is actually an attack technique people call APT now, that the Chinese got really good at in the early 2000s through a number of attacks against defense contractors and the US government directly. If you look today, what the Chinese were able to do in 2009, any Eastern European gangster in a tracksuit can now do, right? Because you can hire a 17-year-old with a laptop and they can pull these exploits off of an exploit market or even existing APT software, repackage it a little bit, and it still works. Perhaps not in as hardened targets like a Northrop Grumman or a Lockheed, but in the normal standard Fortune 500 company, they're still toast against the kind of exploits that we've seen for 6 months to a year. And so if we look right now what the NSA can do, perhaps we'll have a prediction of what is possible for normal people to do 4 or 5 years from now. For example, the Chinese were doing a lot of NTLM2 cracking, which in 2009 was a reasonably expensive thing. Right now, anybody in here who has a reasonably good gaming PC can do the same level of NTLM2 cracking the Chinese could do in 2009 with a supercomputer. NTLM2 is the password-based authentication on Windows networks when you're not doing Kerberos. And it turns out even if you're doing Kerberos, you can make Windows machines speak NTLM-v2, which is something that was used to a great extent by the Chinese during those attacks. Also, a reason to do this is that the Flame attack has taught me to say never say never. Who here has heard of Flame? So Flame's generally considered the successor to Stuxnet, although there's a lot of evidence that Flame existed before Stuxnet existed. And one of the interesting facts about Flame is it uses a certificate that was stolen from Microsoft using an MD5 collision attack against a public certificate authority that was handing out on the internet. And that certificate was then used to attack Windows Update. So it turns out I actually ran the project in 2004 to do the top to bottom security review of what is now Microsoft Update, of the update service and SOAP protocol. And we had that exact attack in our written report, and we said, well, this could happen and this could happen, but don't worry, it's totally impossible, right? And so between 2004 and 2009, it became doable by at least a nation-state attacker. And so, it's things that seem kind of incredible right now might not be so incredible to us in 4 or 5 years, and I think the Snowden stuff, again, gives us a good predictive ability there. And even if you don't care about this stuff, your customers do. And I'll just make it clear, this deck's meant for businesses, so I didn't create kind of an academic deck for academics. You're all businesses, right? Everybody here has a startup, right? Yeah. Every 19-year-old, let 1,000 startups bloom, right, in the dorm rooms. My goal here was to speak to as if you guys are working at a big multinational bank, so you can kind of get a feel of what they're concerned about and what we're telling them. So there's some problems with analyzing the Snowden disclosures. One, it's very difficult to trust his direct assertions. For example, he very famously said that he had direct access to Google servers. Now, what it seems to be, now that we have the raw evidence, that he was talking about a level of access that existed, but he perhaps did not know how that level of access was granted to him. And so it's either a misinterpretation, or he misspoke, or we're just looking at one tiny little part of a huge edited interview. But for the most part, I think it's very difficult to listen to Snowden's direct claims and make analysis of it. So we're only using documents that have been published by the media that look like they're not faked. Now, it's obviously impossible to authenticate any of this stuff, but I have not seen any good claims that things that come out from the Washington Post or Der Spiegel or El Globo, which apparently is Portuguese for the Globo, any of those organizations are faking this stuff, so we're just going to assume that they're accurate. The other problem is that we have a lot of media filter problem with all of this stuff. Either these documents are being, well, one, the stories that are being written are about political impacts, right? So you'll read in Der Spiegel about Angela Merkel's cell phone being listened to, being eavesdropped on. But how did they do that? Did they do that by breaking A5/1 on the GSM and passively sniffing? Did they do it with an IMSI catcher and building a fake GSM base station on top of the US Embassy? Did they do it by implanting software into her, into the baseband? Did they do it by implanting software into the OS core of her phone? All of those are practical, reasonable explanations of how that happened, but the Der Spiegel article doesn't talk about it because they don't really care about the technical side, they care about the interesting political impact. And so because of that, decisions that are being made by the reporters, it's actually very difficult for us on the defense side to figure out what to do. So what we're trying to do is basically read between the lines of the information that's published. And often what you'll see is you'll see a Washington Post article that has a slide deck in their slideshow, and most of the people on the technical side, we just ignore the Washington Post article, and we go straight to the slide deck, and there's something in that slide deck that's much more interesting than whatever the political impact of this person got spied on or this kind of information, that you're able to read between the lines and figure out how technically this stuff works. Okay, so my format today is I'm going to talk about some of the revelations that have come out over the last several months, provide the supporting documentation, and we'll talk through that real quick. A little bit of analysis of what that actually means, and then suggestions if you're an international business and you want to counteract this kind of stuff, what you should do about it. And then we should happily have 10, 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, feel free to throw it out, but let's not get into any kind of political discussions or anything like that until the cameras are turned off. So revelation, the thing that kicked this all off is the original Prism revelation, which turns out to be like the least interesting of all of them, in my opinion, which is the NSA has some kind of automated mechanism to request and get stored data that's currently stored by major cloud providers. This is well described in what a lot of people are calling the world's ugliest PowerPoint deck, as well as a massive violation of copyright law by including all of those logos in there. That's a big no-no. This is a list of providers that they're able to get this data from, as well as a list of what you get. There's a good slide that shows how this collection actually happens, and what you see here is that the data providers are talking to the FBI, not the NSA, right? And so if you were Yahoo or Google and you got one of these requests, you get the request from the FBI under either a FISA warrant, a national security letter, or an FAA 702 order. And then you turn that data over to the FBI. The FBI gives it to the NSA, and then Prism is really less about that collection and more about the internal analysis pipeline that data goes through and to correlate and to store it and all that kind of stuff. This is where I thought that actually the slide deck started to get real interesting, where they talked about Prism versus Upstream collection. So if you look at here, Prism allows you access to stored communications, right? So stuff that's on hard drives in the data centers of these companies. And a number of different selectors. A selector is a way to find out to select from your data set, right? When you look at the NSA slides, you realize the NSA's problem is they have too much data, as a lot of people have talked about. Anybody who's read any of James Banford's books does not find that surprising. They're talking about petabytes and petabytes of data. Finding the interesting stuff is very difficult for them. So they have a lot of focus on selectors of finding ways to pull people out. Phone numbers, email addresses, fuzzy matches on names. A couple of the slides talk a lot about how for some of these names, it's actually you have to be kind of fuzzy because there's different anglicizations of Arabic names and such. And so what I find interesting here, first off, direct relationship with the comms provider only through FBI, right? So this kind of disproves the idea that the NSA, using Prism at least, is directly working with these providers. The FBI normally handles this kind of stuff anyway within the US. And then the upstream side, I always thought that this would be much more interesting. There's no discussion, again, in these stories about the upstream components of these slides, and we'll talk about that in a second. So if you read the Prism stuff, we're really not talking about direct access and like the NSA can go and automatically pull this data. From that and from the slides we've seen in my conversations with people who work on this kind of stuff, is that really Prism is about having a portal that allows these folks to request data in an automated fashion, then have it uploaded. But that there should be a human in the loop at these companies. That doesn't mean they always implement it. But generally, my understanding is at these companies, there's a human being that looks at the request, judges it, decides whether they're going to fight it or not, and then uploads it. This actually brings up a real interesting problem for anybody who operates an internet service these days, which is dealing with the thousands of different law enforcement agencies around the world. I have a relative who works in a department like this at a major internet company, and they get things like a faxed request from a tiny police department in Germany saying this is a legal warrant signed by a German judge in German requesting a Gmail account for somebody who has kidnapped a child and has asked for a ransom, right? And so that's like a legitimate request that has to be handled, but how do you authenticate that over a fax and then make an interpretation of the local laws and whether or not it's a legitimate judge? That kind of thing's really difficult. And so it seems that what Prism is about is bringing all of those requests in the US for a national security context together into a central workflow where they can be requested and handled and then uploaded in a secure way, so they're not doing things like printing up people's text messages and then faxing them to the FBI or dropping them in FedEx or something like that. It's likely that Prism varies on a per provider basis. And if you as I said, the slides demonstrate the data comes to the FBI. So if you're a company and you get the request from the FBI, it's actually very tough to tell whether or not that's an FBI thing or if it's a 3-letter agency thing. One of the important takeaways here, though, from an analysis perspective, is if the FBI comes to you and says, okay, well, we're not changing anything legally, we're not asking for anything untoward, but we're going to have you as part of this program that's going to sound really mysterious, but don't worry, nobody will ever find out about it. That perhaps you should worry a little bit. And I think the ability for these companies to participate in this stuff in the future is going to be very difficult. So what do you do if you're a company here? This is mostly a legal issue, it's not a technical issue. If you haven't to this point, at this point, every major provider in the world has now thought about this. But it's amazing how many companies store data have not thought about the legal access issue. They haven't thought about the Communications Decency Act, DMCA, CALEA, and all the different laws that govern the turnover of data, and the FISA Authorization Act, obviously, turn over this data to law enforcement. So you need to think long and hard about what different requests, what kind of process you're going to go through, and who authorizes that, and what your policy is going to be. And it's good to publish that policy. And most of these companies, if you search for their name, and then you search for like law enforcement policy, you'll find a PDF that they give out to law enforcement saying this is how you ask for data, and this is what we'll give you, and this is what you won't. And while that's not supposed to normally be public, they know it's going to leak, and it's nothing that secret, and it's actually a very interesting read. The FFA Section 702 stuff is even more interesting because that's like the metadata request of Verizon, which again is mostly a legal issue, it's not a technical issue. But I think this is something that has to be taken care of more democratically than anything else. Thinking that designing end-to-end encryption is going to save you against this obviously is not. If you look at the LavaBit example, that's a company that was forced to go out of business because they were not able to. They were turning over only encrypted inboxes because the encryption of those mailboxes was happening in JavaScript in the browsers, and so the government eventually had a judge try to force the owner of LavaBit to backdoor that JavaScript to steal the password so they could decrypt it offline. He refused to, and instead of doing that, he actually shut down the entire company. There is a regulatory arbitrage opportunity here, and I would not be shocked if what we see is American companies building data centers overseas, putting the data of people from those countries and keeping them physically there, and then either using encryption or controls to maintain access to that only to employees that are outside the reach of the US government. And that's probably a survival mechanism that we'll see from some of these folks.
It's not just Prism. It's also disclosure for lawsuits. If data flows through the United States, it's open to discovery.
Right. And
even without TLAs involved.
If you talk to any of the lawyers at these companies, they say divorce attorneys are the worst for that. Because almost anything is relevant in a divorce case, right? And so it turns out that a lot of stuff, there's a lot of interesting law about that's been created by divorces. Like, for example, the fast tracks and such. There's all this interesting law around tracking those because divorce attorneys have figured out, oh, I think this person's mistress is on the other side of a bridge. Therefore, we're going to subpoena the data records. And so there's...
The other side of Manhattan.
Or the other side of Manhattan, yeah, exactly. The next interesting revelation, the thing that was the upstream side of that slide, was that the NSA is actually doing full-on sniffing of major points of presence of the internet around the world, hoovering up whatever data looks interesting to them, and then building an analysis pipeline where that data gets reduced and eventually gets sent to a central location where it gets stored. One of those databases was called XKeystore, and XKeystore shows up in a lot of different places here. This is one of the slides from that original Prism slide deck where they talk about the difference between Prism and Upstream. And then Fairview, Stormbrew, Blarney, and Oakstar, we know what some of those are, but not all of them. But those are mostly things that then use the upstream collectors to then correlate data, then figure out interesting things about these targets. This is a good background from the NSA of why this works, which is if you look at how undersea cables work, if you go to telegeography, for example, they like to map how the physical infrastructure of the internet, what you'll see is that a huge amount of the traffic between different continents all flows through North America. It's basically impossible to get a packet from South America to Europe without flowing through a US points of presence, which has to do with history and the companies that own it, as well as geography, right? It's a lot longer trip to go across the South Atlantic, for example, and not as much economic benefit to do it. Perhaps that's going to change a little bit. But as these guys talk about, you can do sniffing in the United States and catch a huge amount of traffic that you would not expect is actually flowing physically through the US. This is a fun thing to test whenever you go travel. I went to Buenos Aires during this whole thing. I did a bunch of trace routes to European IP addresses, and I bounced off of Miami a lot. It was a lot of fun. Yes, ma'am.
Is it a lot cheaper to go Asia Pacific to US than to Europe directly?
Is it cheaper for like companies or from like a TTL perspective? There's actually a lot of good stories here that you hear when crazy stuff happens with BGP routing when you cut a fiber optic cable and such, and you'll hear crazy stories about how these cables actually work. When I was at LoudCloud, somebody pulled a backhoe across a fiber optic cable in Nebraska. Anybody know where all the fiber optic cables are buried across the US? Railroad tracks, that's right. If you think about it, you want to pull a cable 3,000 miles, you can either deal with 100,000 farmers and buy their land on the way, or you can just call it, Southern Pacific, and then buy a 6-inch strip of their right-of-way, which was already granted them by Congress in like 1850 something. And so that's how they lay these cables. Is they have like a big train where there's the front train digs a trench, and then they lay the conduit, and then they lay the cable in, and then they cover it over, and then they just pull it. And so, but a lot of construction happens around these. People build train stations and dig gas pipes and all that kind of stuff. Somebody pulled a backhoe and cut like 4 fiber optic cables all at once in Nebraska. And for a while, the routing for LoudCloud's East Coast and West Coast data centers were hopping through Europe and Asia. So there are fiber optic cables across Russia, but a lot of it is transoceanic because it's really hard to dig in Siberia, right? Anyway, telegeography is a great place to read about this kind of stuff. This is the map that came out later about all of these sniffing sites. And so you can see the biggest ones here, the blue ones, are ones that are the large cable sniffing. This is most likely the sniffing that's being done with the cooperation of the companies involved. So a lot of the information we know about this, we actually knew in 2007 because a gentleman who worked at AT&T here at the Folsom Street AT&T office blew the whistle and called the EFF after he saw that there was a passive fiber optic tap on a major fiber optic line AT&T that then went into a classified room where the NSA had racks and racks of equipment. And so there's a whole lawsuit and such, and the lawsuit was squished by Congress ex post facto. There's all this interesting law around it. But anyway, that's the kind of sniffing that cannot be done without the company knowing, right? We're not talking about tiny little fiber optic taps here. You're talking about people sniffing huge sonnet rings that do terabits per second across multiple DWDM colors, right? And so realistically, to sniff that, to demultiplex it, and then to look at it in real time, you're going to have racks and racks of equipment, and you're going to be pulling tens or hundreds of kilowatts of power, right? So almost certainly, all those big blue ones are the places where the NSA has made a deal with the providers, the companies that have run it, which also makes sense because if you look at the blue ones, they're all in companies, they're all either in countries that we're allies with, or they're on cables that are partially owned by a US company. Then if you look at the smaller ones, you've got like the yellow ones, which are all through China, and the red ones, that seems much more likely to be something that is not well known to the host country or the host company. So it's either going to be a physical tap somewhere in the middle of nowhere that they've put in place, or perhaps a software tap. And since this has come out, we've learned about the kind of software implants that the NSA has for Juniper and Cisco routers and such. So it is possible that those are implants that aren't doing sniffing all the time, that they're doing, they wouldn't be able to pull the entire, 10 gigabit WAN link or something like that, but maybe they can do some individual looking at packets and pull it off of a router in the middle of nowhere. My guess is that this map has changed significantly since it leaked. This is the chart that came out of the EFF's lawsuit of how this hookup works in the AT&T office. What was interesting was it was a passive link, so the NSA is not really man in the middle of the situation. They're just passively listening to traffic go back and forth. Turns out this can be leveraged to create a man in the middle attack, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Part of the slide deck talked about how useful it was just to sniff HTTP because such a huge amount of traffic goes over it. This is kind of an embarrassment to our industry that we have this entire time had the technology to keep this data secure, at least against a passive sniffer attacker like the NSA, but we never really bothered to. And a huge chunk of people's day-to-day lives is already done on totally unencrypted connections. Here's an example of, I believe this is the XKeystore database. So it shows you what the GUI interface looks like. A lot of these slides are really blurry. I think this is actually a screenshot of a TV show that then had a camera pointed at a TV screen where they had a screenshot that was put into a PowerPoint deck. So this is a part of that media filter problem. It's kind of difficult to get to the details when we've gone through that many levels. But from this, you can kind of see what XKeystore is storing, which it looks like billions and billions of pieces of email that then can be searched on things like headers and what's mentioned into it, stuff like that, email addresses and such. So our analysis here. So it seems that the NSA is using optical taps in this case, which an optical tap on like an AT&T backbone connection is going to get you not just public internet traffic, but it's going to get you all the phone calls that are routed on Sonnet on there, MPLS connections, even dedicated Lambda. We'll talk about that in a second. One of the reasons they're doing this passive sniffing probably is because it prevents any leakage from going to the carriers, right? So the NSA certainly does not want to ask AT&T, please give us the email from this person, right? It's classified that they're looking at that person. Or, and only in some cases do they want to ask for everything, like in the FAA 702 warrant that went to Verizon to ask for the entire metadata. And so a passive sniff allows NSA to pick and choose what they want, and it allows the owners of these cables to kind of cover their eyes and their ears and pretend that they don't know anything's going on. They're like, oh, well, the NSA said they're only following the law, but we can't verify that because we're giving them everything. It seems that almost all of the major US and many overseas carriers are implicated. Most of the cables that run, or I think all of the cables that run to and from North America are joint ventures between a US, a domestic, and another company, often level 3 communications, Global Crossing, British Telecom, AT&T. All those folks they create these special companies that own the cable, and then you have a joint venture to build it. There's a famous NTT and AT&T who do a lot of the ones to Japan. So it'd be interesting, there's some interesting political things here, whether or not the partners in these joint ventures knew that one side of their fiber optic cable was being tapped. I'm sure there's been lots of fun phone calls in Japanese. But as you can see, as we saw that map, there's collection points all around the world. So we're probably also talking about secret taps, which I would guess would have much more limited capacity, right? If the United States already obviously has the ability to do really cool stuff, like have submarines go and tap fiber optic cables, but we're not dropping an entire data center and a multi-megawatt power plant on the bottom of the Red Sea, right? So it's likely that kind of stuff is much more limited in scope. Obviously, the NSA can't record everything. So if you look at these slides, you see that there's a very steep funnel where they're trying to throw away the stuff they don't want. That turns out to be real easy, right? Because if you get rid of Netflix and YouTube, that's actually something like 60% of bandwidth in a number of different backbone locations. And so my guess is what they're getting is like Netflow analysis, right? This IP talked to this IP at this time. Emails, perhaps the entire body, at least the to and from in the subject headers. SMS messages will be real easy. SMS messages come as Series 7 packets over the Series 7 network, which is on the same fiber optic cable and goes over SONET. Those are completely unencrypted. And my guess is they're also trying to get DNS. It turns out analyzing a DNS record of somebody gives you a huge amount of knowledge into what they're doing on the internet. This is a very useful thing to know as a defender, because if you want to set up your organization to be able to deal with a major breach like Google and those companies faced from Aurora, then having logs of every DNS request from your corporate network is super, super powerful. And likewise, DNS requests are nice, small, 170 byte requests. They can press up real easily. Just grabbing every single DNS request is not that hard. In fact, I'm part of this organization called DNS OARC because we're doing a bunch of DNS analysis where you just pay $5,000 and you sign an NDA and you get access to what's called the day in the life data, which are snapshots of 3 days of requests to the root servers. And 3 days of requests to all the root servers is only about 8 terabytes, right? So that's obviously the amount of data you can get out of that is spectacular for a very small amount of storage. So what should you do about it? So clearly, I mean, if we're trying to defend against passive attackers sniffing all this data, the easiest / hardest solution is to move everything to HTTPS. It's very easy for us in the security industry to say, oh, just do HTTPS. It's no problem. It turns out when you start to look in production level sites, some of these companies have on the order of 100,000 front end servers doing HTTP and SSL termination, right? So on a level of hundreds of thousands of cores, anything that adds or subtracts 15% CPU power, I mean, you're literally talking about the amount of energy dissipated by small towns, right? That you're changing from these companies. I'm not joking, right? The amount of power that you're talking about and hardware that you have to throw at it is pretty spectacular. And so it is not totally cheap to do that. But it is what we have to do. And fortunately, the IETF is moving this way already. Anybody here been following HTTP 2.0? Yeah. Yeah, so HTTP 2.0 is going to be a standard that's probably coming out in late 2014, early 2015 to replace HTTP 1.1 that we've been living with for a long time. HTTP 2.0, the base was just a copy of the Speedy protocol that Google created. Speedy, by default, does non-authenticated TLS, right? So it does kind of opportunistic TLS with a Diffie-Hellman handshake. You're not required to use a certificate, so you don't have to have verification of the server side, but that's good enough to prevent this kind of widespread sniffing. And so Speedy's not supported by a lot of people. Obviously, Google supports it, Facebook supports it, and a couple other big companies. Chrome and Firefox support it, but IE doesn't. But as soon as this becomes HTTP 2.0, I would expect all the browsers, all the mobile operating systems, and all major providers will eventually support it. In which case, this kind of attack will become much less useful by the NSA. Another thing you should think about is elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, perfect for secrecy. There are some interesting caveats on the crypto stuff, and I think I'll talk about that a little bit later. Our recommendation to companies is not to use POTS phone lines for any critical conversations. So there's nothing you can do basically to secure a conversation from one phone line to another. If I was the NSA or any other national security apparatus around the world, I would be tapping into the fiber optic cables that lead into major conference providers, right? And there actually turns out to be 5 or 6 major companies that handle like 80% of the conference calls for the Fortune 500. And so if just a couple of good taps and you can grab all of those conference calls, the real problem is going to be what to do with that data, whether or not you have good enough voice recognition to do automatic transcription, that kind of stuff. POTS, I'm sorry, plain old telephone service. So you pick up the phone, you get a dial tone, that's POTS. I was going to say analog, but it's pretty much not analog except the last quarter mile between, landline, yeah. So our recommendations to big companies is to use VoIP trunking over VPN connections. Now VoIP has all its own interesting security problems. Most corporate networks are insecure enough that they have the VoIP phones and the desktops and the laptops all in the same broadcast domain. And in a situation like that, just any laptop can then listen to any internal phone call. And there are standards for security for VoIP, but nobody uses them because it makes the phones not work. So there are ways you could do it better, but at least if you're going to have a critical conversation between executives, they really shouldn't be picking up the normal phone. They need to be doing it on an internal network only. What else to do? Think a lot about DNS and namespace leakage. So if you look at the OARC records, what you'll see is that for most major companies, you can look at their DNS requests and figure out all of their internal names of their servers. Because at some point, they're leaking a lot of those requests. So you need to think a lot if you're going to use a standard rooted DNS namespace internally, or even if not, then you're going to have leakage either from the networks from improperly configured DNS resolvers or by people taking laptops in and out, right, of the network. You should really support SMTPTLS. So that's opportunistic encryption of SMTP flowing between mail exchangers. It's simple to enable. It's not that simple to make it work because there's a lot of different standards about what the certificate C name should look like. The different mail exchangers interpret different SMTP/TLS stuff. This is the kind of thing I think as an industry we need to focus on, the interoperability and making sure that this works all over the place. Another fun revelation. So the NSA in doing this widespread sniffing is not just sniffing the public internet, they're sniffing all the private WAN links between companies. Anybody here worked at a carrier before? At an AT&T or Verizon or UUNet? I see a lot of gray beards, so there's got to be a UUNet. Yeah. How you doing, sir? So if you work in one of those companies, what you find out is that as a percentage of the bandwidth that's been sold, internet traffic is actually a small fraction of what these companies sell. They make almost no money off peering doing internet traffic. It's almost just a loss leader for advertising. Where they make their money is selling pre-provisioned bandwidth in a couple of different products out to companies to run their WAN links. So all of the major internet providers are huge customers of this. And it's because a long time ago, they figured out, and Google's probably the first people to move hard into this, but they've all followed, Facebook and Yahoo and all those guys. They've realized that if you want to talk to Google from Brazil, it is absolutely the slowest way to do it is from the internet from Brazil to the US, what they should do is terminate that connection in Brazil and then route the traffic. If the request has to be served out of the US, you route it over a private link because you get way more provisioned bandwidth, way better quality of service if you're paying lots of money to these companies to provide you private links. Now, the thing about these private links, people talk about we're getting a private link, we're getting a leased line. You know, you call up level 3 and you say, I want a leased line between Minneapolis and Chicago. They don't go and have a backhoe go pull a trench, right? What they're going to do is they're going to provision out bandwidth in some way between, most likely using MPLS, which is for those of you who don't use it, is what's called a layer 2.5 protocol, which is really just a header that's put in front of the IP header that says this is part of a connection that needs to be routed in a special way. So they go and they pre-provision the bandwidth and they do a bunch of quality of service settings. And so you're traveling over the same fiber optic cables that carry internet traffic, but you have a special header so that level 3 doesn't let it leave that kind of pre-provisioned link. And and if there's a bad quality of service thing, they throw away the internet traffic, people's YouTube and Netflix first, and then you're paying them a bunch of money so that you get a better quality of service. Obviously, that's if you're doing a fiber optic tap. The NSA sees that traffic go right across that fiber optic line just with a header in front of it, right? And I'm sure they're highly qualified to drop that header and then parse that traffic and put it into their databases, which we know they've been doing. For the big boys, they're probably buying dedicated lambda, dedicated bandwidth, actual colors on these links. And it's understood that companies like Google and such will go to a global crossing and say, hey, great, you've got a cable to England. We want to have dedicated bandwidth on that. And so they have dedicated equipment that then goes into DWDM multiplexing equipment and then gets sent over. But obviously, if there is a fiber optic tap between, downstream of that, then all of that gets added up in the same place. And so if you look through the slides, they talk about some of the targets. Google, Swift. Swift is one of the financial market utilities I was talking about. They handle most of the big transactions between banks around the world where you're moving just cash. They're headquartered in Switzerland, but they have to operate everywhere. So they have a very extensive WAN network across the world. A French MFA, Petrobras, which is the Brazilian oil company, which is where this is a slide that comes from Brazilian TV, where they're talking about, this is all about terrorism, but they're looking at the oil company. This is from a relevant slide deck, my favorite slide ever written by anybody, which somebody at the NSA had a lot of fun. The smiley makes this awesome. I mean, this is great. This actually makes me think you shouldn't use Visio, right? Like, if you could, it's better just to draw something like this and put a smiley face on it and spice up your presentation. So as this talks about the layout of the Google network, which, as you can see here, so there's a thing called the GFE, which is a Google front end. And those are the front server. That's the first place that you enter Google's property when you go and talk to any Google property. And basically the way Google does this is all the GFEs are identical. So pretty much all of Google's services are available going through those GFEs. They terminate the SSL connection. They look at what you're requesting. Oh, you want to talk to mail. Oh, you want to talk to search. Oh, you want to talk to news. And then those GFEs intelligently route that request now in plain text across Google's private network to whatever server handles it, right? So if you're an American and you have a Gmail account and you're traveling in Brazil, and you terminate a Brazilian GFE, but your mailbox is in the US, then at some point in that path, they say, oh, okay, well, you need to go to a US Gmail cluster. And so that gets routed over the internal network. The result being that all of that traffic between their data centers is unencrypted over the internal network. And therefore, if you're the NSA and you're tapping those fiber optic lines, you're able to get all of that traffic and parse it out. Yes?
Why do you say this doesn't require FISA review?
So there's an argument. The question is, why doesn't this require FISA review? How is the NSA justifying this? And there is, at least in the decks we have, where what they're saying is the NSA is only doing this in links between international data centers of these companies. So what they're doing is they're tapping like at the fiber optic line on the side of England, and they're able to get all the traffic between the Virginia data center and the London data center, but they're technically trapping it in the UK. They're also saying that the majority of the traffic is for foreign nationals, and so the collection of American data is only incidental. So I saw actually a great translation of what these different words mean to the NSA, and the word incidental means basically they're saying if 51% of it is foreigners, then they can do it, which makes sense because something like probably 70%, 80% of Google's customers are not Americans, right? So if you gather all of Google's data, by definition, it's majority foreigners. It just happens to be you get every American, but Americans aren't more than 50%. Now, there is some data, though, that we see that I think means that they're actually tapping within the US. But as my wife wants me to clarify, I don't actually have any internal information here, so you're not hearing anything new. This is all interpretation in looking at these slides. But if you look at some of the things they have, like, for example, there's a big slide deck that talks about reading Yahoo's backup archives. And so unless Yahoo's doing full archive backups overseas, then to grab that data, they would have to be tapping domestic cables too.
Or having GCHQ do it for them.
Or having GCHQ do it for them. Yeah, there's a lot of discussion in these slides about the Five Eyes, which are basically the Anglophone countries. The US, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand are the core group of countries that all cooperate on this kind of stuff. And so a lot of these folks are doing the trapping of the data and then sharing systems. In fact, I think our next thing is all GCHQ decks, but they're talking about they have a backend connection to the NSA for sharing data and that kind of stuff. So anyway, by this is probably where Ed Snowden gets his I have direct access to Google servers, because if you're doing this correctly, you're eventually going to be able to gather up almost all the data Google stores, right? They do entire replications of data centers. So if a whole data center falls into the earth or gets destroyed, they have all that data somewhere else. So at some point, all of the data is going to be backed up over their private WAN links. This has led to some blowback. This is a friend of mine named Brandon Downey. I'm not going to read this, but you can imagine he was not very happy about this. The context here is that Google's been on kind of DEFCON 2 ever since 2009, which, the Aurora attacks were kind of a loss of innocence for the tech industry, because there's always been an interesting level of, a lot of people hacking these companies and trying to break in and such. But in 2009, we really kind of realized that several nation states, China, Russia, for example, have full teams whose dedicated job it is to break into these companies, right? And that's actually a pretty terrifying thing. When you think about, there's somebody whose job, 9 to 5, they come into an office, and they're going to get a bonus if they're able to read my email, right? That's not what we normally in the security industry think of. We think of talented amateurs, people who are probabilistically breaking into systems, perhaps people that want to make money and are going to do so the easiest way possible. That's a lot different than my full-time job is to make your job harder. And so since 2009, Google and all these companies have invested a lot into security. They've done a lot of work to close doors against these attackers, and they've done so with the help of the US government. After 2009, NSA and FBI, DNI, all those folks got involved in giving targeting information about possible threat actors overseas to these companies, have been working with suggestions and such. And so, you can imagine you've got Brandon Downey and his friends barring up the windows against the zombies on the outside, with the NSA and FBI standing behind them saying good job, and then rifling through the filing cabinet, right, while they're doing that work. And so it's more than anything else, this backbone sniffing thing has caused a huge amount of blowback in the tech industry and a lot of anger. The other reason people are angry is there's been a lot of fighting over what FISA means and all of the legal controls around it. And so on the front end, the US government has been requesting data from tech companies. Sometimes the tech companies appeal it and they have a big legal fight. But it turns out none of that matters. That was all kind of a kabuki dance, because in the back end, they're getting all that data anyway. This is where people who believe in the rule of law really start to think this whole thing breaks down. If we're going to have laws that authorize the government to pull this data down, that's great. But those laws need to actually be able to be fought over, not applied unilaterally by stealing this data through the back door. So some analysis here. Like I talked about, the documents generally reference GCHQ as a source. So a lot of these taps are probably offshore and then provided through Five Eyes. You might be safe if your links are only domestic, maybe not. The documents describe writing proprietary code for data, so it's not just Google's HTTP requests. It's things like I talked about. There's a whole slide deck about all the work that had to go into Yahoo's compressed email backup format, and they wrote a whole set of parsers to automatically parse it and decompress it and such. So what they're doing probably is they're capturing everything, minimizing layer. This is somewhat obvious now that we say it now. MPLS, like I said, doesn't provide you with any extra security. So what do you do? So the natural solution here is you have to encrypt all internal connections. Again, just like saying just do HTTPS, this is one of those fun things that's easy for us to say in the security industry. It's a lot harder to do at scale. There are two kind of options here. One is Wirespeed VPN, right? This means having a box on that fiber optic cable before it leaves your data center, encrypt all your traffic before it gets to another physical site that you control. Now, the downside here is those kinds of machines are expensive. Buying a Wirespeed VPN that runs at the speed that's never going to break, and then you have to buy 2 of them, right, in case it does break, is not cheap. They don't fail gracefully, right? So as anybody who's run a production level network knows, when you start to do VPN of all your traffic, you end up with unrepeatable errors that are very difficult to debug, and VPN does not make that easier. Another problem is that if you take all of your traffic and encapsulate it, then it's completely opaque to the carriers, and the carriers can't do any kind of routing or quality of service, right? Because all they see is TCP packets coming along with fully encrypted payloads. And so some of these companies are actually having the level 3s and the global crossings and the MCIs and those kinds of folks do routing for them. And so if you do this, you might have to have some complicated separation between IP addresses, and you're going to have to do a lot of thinking about OSPF and whether or not that routing happens, how quality of service works and such. The other option is to do encryption server to server, to have dual authenticated encryption between the servers as they talk to each other. And then you still do the unencrypted WAN, but it doesn't matter because nothing hits that unencrypted. This requires support in your software. Which is not super easy, right? This is easy if you write your own software. It's not super easy, but it's doable if you write your own software. It might be impossible if you don't write your own software. It requires the ability to push keys out to all your servers. And it requires a whole kind of operational framework to support that. The benefit is the Wirespeed VPN, this security issue still exists inside of your data center, where if you go server to server, now you're protected all the way up to server. So if you have a compromise of the network stack in your data center, you're still in reasonably good shape. My expectation is the Wirespeed VPN is the kind of thing you do if you're a bank or an insurance company or kind of an old school company where you're not writing your own software. You're going to have legacy products that have unencrypted communication no matter what. You can't do anything about it. Trust me, there's no way to make 2 mainframes talk to each other securely by changing the mainframes, right? You can't get TLS support into a Kix app on a ZOS machine. What you have to do is put network equipment on the outside of those devices. And so that's what you're going to do. If you're those guys, if you're a Google or somebody like that, you'll probably go more in the server-to-server encryption because you have the ability to change your own software around it and handle it that way. Cool. Another fun revelation. So the NSA actually, while we've been talking about passive sniffing, actually has the ability to do active man-in-the-middle attacks against target individuals. One of the context of one of these revelations was around Belgicom, which is one of the telephone providers in Belgium. Anybody know why you'd want to target a cell phone provider in Belgium? Is there? It's where the EU is, yes. So if you can read all this, if you can listen to all the cell phone calls in Brussels, you'll be able to predict what the EU is going to do in almost any circumstance, right? So it's a great place to be able to do that. Now, apparently, Belgicom wasn't just turning this data over to the NSA, which totally makes sense. If you're Belgium and you want to keep the economy from having the EU in town, you're not going to go cooperate with the US on this. And so what the NSA needed to do was take over the machine of technical workers of sysadmins, basically, working inside of Belgicom. And they talked about 2 different methods, either hacking the routers in place or doing what's called quantum insert shots. So the router hacking is pretty basic. You break into a router, you set a static route, and now you're able to intercept some traffic. And the goal here was to intercept a totally generic request for some not important site, but then insert ODE malware into that response and use it to take over their machine, right? So instead of, the way the Chinese did this is they spearphished these employees. They did lots of investigation of who these people are on social networks, and then they put together an email that was very specifically targeted at that person where they thought they most likely could get them to click on a link. And then from there, they took over the machine. But that creates a trail, right? That email now lives in the email server. And when, during this investigation, we found out where those emails were coming from, that helped us figure out where the initial point of infection is. The NSA knows that that's a weakness, so they want to find some kind of ephemeral way to take over somebody's connection and seed malware onto the machine. So the router hacking is one way. The other way was what they call quantum targeting. So quantum seems to be a system that utilizes the fact that the NSA is doing passive sniffing, but in very privileged locations, to then do an active man-in-the-middle attack by inserting traffic and beating the legitimate packet to the customer, to the user. And so, as it talks about here, basically they watch for a TCP SYN and a SYNAC. They observe the SYNAC, and then they try to send the first bit of the HTTP payload before the first legitimate HTTP packet happens. This is what that looks like. It's a pretty simple flow, right? So it's just like TCP sequence injection, but they see the TCP sequence number because they're passively sniffing it, right? So you don't have to guess the TCP sequence number. You can just insert the traffic, and as long as you beat it, you're okay. So unlike, say, like the Chinese, they're not actually man in the middle, so this is not a perfectly reliable exploit technique. CMIC is the Chinese National Network Information Center. These are the people who operate the Great Firewall, which has been demonstrated to have active man-in-the-middle capability, not just filtering capability. What are they inserting? Most likely it looks like, and there's some other description of this, they're inserting a small JavaScript include. That JavaScript include comes off of a server that the NSA controls, and it asynchronously basically sends a request. From that request, they're able to fingerprint the browser and then dynamically choose an exploit kit, send back an exploit, take over that browser, and then have it call home, either over the same connection or over a different connection. Probably a different connection. It's actually difficult to make those kinds of exploits work in browsers reliably over the same connection. They probably call home over a different connection.
Has this actually been observed, or are you guessing?
It's all in the slide deck, yeah.
No, but has this been observed?
Oh, I don't think anybody, I have not seen like a TCP dump or something of this happening, yeah. But in the slide deck, they kind of explain how it all works and how they have the ability to dynamically choose payloads based upon, okay, it's Firefox this version, and they have Java, so we'll use a Java payload, or they have Flash, or if it's an old IE, we'll just do an IE payload, something like that. My guess is they're also doing this on DNS because if you have a double response, inserting something in HTTP stream has a little bit of danger, right? You could break the flow. I'm actually also a little wondering. There's a little interesting. This has only come out a couple weeks ago. So initially, I didn't think they were doing TCP inserts. I thought they were just doing DNS, but now it's obvious they're doing HTTP. I would think that this would cause a TCP reset because you'd have a double ACK from two different packets, but apparently these TCP stacks don't do it. So anybody here who's an enterprising grad student who wants to write a fun little paper, going and looking at the vulnerability of client TCP stacks to getting two totally different TCP payloads with the same sequence number would be interesting because, and it'd be interesting to look at what kind of logging happens because then if that gets logged in some way, people could log and look for this kind of attack happening.
It sounds like be generous in what you accept.
Right, and the reality is you've got the spec, and then you've got real life where weird crap like this probably happens all the time, right? I was looking because I thought it was DNS, and it turns out you often get two responses to DNS requests because you'll have weird things like a caching resolver in the middle, send requests out to multiple sites, or send a request out, timeout, send a new one, but then get a response, before the timeout's over, that kind of stuff. So.
It might be turned off by now.
Yeah. I mean, I would guess that they're not doing this anymore in this way. So, best protection here is, again, HTTPS everywhere. We also suggest HSTS, which is HTTP Strict Transport Security, which is the mechanism to tell browsers to cache the fact that you run under HTTPS and not allow HTTP. HPKP, which allows you then to pin that certificate to which certificate you're using, and certificate transparency.
But Symantec is a U.S. company.
Symantec's a U.S. company. Yeah, actually, I got some more stuff about this. That's why I want certificate transparency. Although, interesting enough, Symantec's the company that's right now holding back certificate transparency, which is interesting. So another interesting revelation that's related to this is the NSA likes to unwrap TLS connections, which is not shocking, but apparently they're good enough at it that it's something that their analysts can use on a regular basis. This is a slide from GCHQ, where this shows GCHQ sniffing technology that then talks back to the NSA to get keys, right? So the GCHQ watches the traffic, records it locally, and then they see what the handshake's like, and they go call up the NSA through an enterprise service bus, and they say, hey, do you have the private key for this certificate? And then the NSA responds, says, here's the private key, and then GCHQ can go decrypt that traffic locally. What's interesting here is if you look over here, long haul is the code name of whatever's doing it. Pairing encrypt attacks attaches something called HPC resources. Anybody guess what HPC means there? Hyperforce computing, right? So they are doing something that has to do with doing big computer stuff. It's not just stolen keys. This is what that interface looks like if you want to go look for this stuff Again, this is a screenshot from, I think, Brazilian TV again. If you want to go look up and try to find a private key for like an IP address, you can go query it and they'll give it to you. Sorry?
Who do you query?
This is a database the NSA runs called Flying Pig. So,
And we can all just go in there and query a private key?
right, yeah. So they say, okay, great, you're talking to mail.stanford.edu. Oh, I wonder if we already have the private key for that. And then they go in here and says, yep, here's the private key. You go load it in your software and it goes decrypts the traffic.
Oh, I can't do that.
You can't do it. No. Turns out, although if there's budget cuts, who knows? Maybe this will be a software as a service. No. This is an internal NSA interface. So far, yeah. So a quick analysis of this. There's no indication of magic abilities, like any kind of really interesting cryptographic breakthroughs. But obviously, cryptanalysis is being used because of the HPC, the Hyperforce Computing. What it looks like they're doing is they're saying, great, there's only X sites in the world we care about, so let's put a huge amount of effort in getting the private keys of those X sites, and then we can use that over and over again, right? So if you just set up a random HTTPS site, it's unlikely the NSA is going to care enough to get your key. But if you are, a message board that terrorists like to use, or if you're Google or Facebook, then they're going to care enough to spend some time. And they're either doing that by exploiting the front-end system and stealing the key, or by doing some kind of cryptanalysis. RSA 1024 has been calculated multiple times. Lots of people have demonstrated that if you have enough money in like the $50 to $100 million range, then attacking it is totally reasonable. And that's especially true in this circumstance, where you can record all this traffic, go attack it asynchronously, and then go use that private key to go decrypt it, assuming perfect forward secrecy is not being used. I bet it's this one too, right? This is again like a failure of our industry kind of overall, is the way we do this is we create front-end machines or load balancers. We have hundreds or thousands of them, and every single one of them has a copy of the private key, right? So they're like the most exposed, least protected systems, and they've got the piece of data, one of the pieces of data we care the most about. And so my expectation is that over the next couple decades, we're going to change the way we do this so that we remote that handshake into a much more protected infrastructure, or we're going to use HSM components to protect those keys. So what should you do? Consider using HSM. So if you're a small enough organization, then it's not with 100,000, but with a couple dozen machines, then it's practical to have hardware security modules hold these keys so that if those servers are broken into, they can force them to do unwrapping live, but they can't pull that key out. We recommend perfect forward secrecy on all TLS. If you're going to do perfect forward secrecy, you have to do elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. My summer talk this summer was all about interesting breakthroughs in the discrete log problem, which Dan Bonet was nice enough to turn us on to, and that there's some interesting stuff going on in that area of mathematics that might show Diffie-Hellman over prime fields being insecure within the next several years. The way TLS works is the Diffie-Hellman exchange for perfect forward secrecy actually happens in plain text. So you'll have an RSA handshake to authenticate a server, you'll generate a secret, and then you'll do a signed Diffie-Hellman exchange, but that's not encrypted by a symmetric key. So you can just do this yourself. Go to Google with perfect forward secrecy with a modern browser, and then do a Wireshark, and you can watch it, and you can watch the perfect forward secrecy handshake. So if there's a vulnerability in how perfect forward secrecy works, it doesn't matter how good the other crypto is. You can just get the secret key from there and decrypt the symmetric part. We recommend using HSTS and HPKP to limit the attack surface, right? So if you use HSTS, then at least everybody coming to your site's using HTTPS. If you use HPKP, you can reduce that down to only your certificate that's owned, right? So this is the semantic problem. If you don't trust your certificate authority, then you don't really have to. With HPKP, you can tell browsers that come to you only use the certificate, don't allow them to sign something else. Now again, a bad certificate authority attack can only work in an active man-in-the-middle situation. We've seen that they can do that through quantum insert, but that's not as widespread as this other kind of sniffing. But I would guess that the NSA has been able to get American companies to turn over certificates to them. Certainly, the certificate authority system is totally broken. You look in your browser right now, you've got the Turkish government, the Chinese government, the Russian government all have certificates in your certificate authority store. So honestly, the US is probably the least of your worries there. And if you're a company that's interested in this kind of stuff, get yourself on the preload list. So Chrome has burned into its code a list of these sites only use HTTPS, and they only use these certificates. So right now, if you go to Twitter from Chrome, you actually will never try HTTP, and you won't accept a random certificate signed by CMIC or the Russians or whatever with the Twitter C name, you'll reject it because it's in the HSTS preload list. Which right now there's no good standard for this. You have to actually like call a guy up at Google and he puts you in the list, and then the Firefox team just pulls that down into their repository. Hopefully there'll be a more standard way of doing this in the future. If you want to trust your certificate authority, then the only way really to get that is to get them to implement certificate transparency, which is an interesting protocol Google has gone standardized to basically means that in a cryptographically secure and a privacy enhancing way, the certificate authorities publish a list of an obfuscated list of all the certificates they've ever given out. And so in a situation like that, if a certificate authority gets a request from a government, they can say, okay, sir, here's a new cert. Either I could put it in the certificate transparency list, and if anybody's paying attention, they're going to see I just gave the cert out, and that company is going to say, hey, we didn't ask for it. And we're going to say, I have no comment, and then they're going to know. Or we don't put it in the certificate transparency list, and if a browser checks, then it's going to scream, and it's going to call home and tell them that it's not a bad cert. So, sorry?
One point, the RFC isn't quite published yet, but it looks like it's going to be soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's something draft status. I mean, IETF has like 9 levels of purgatory, right? So I don't really understand which level of purgatory it's in. But interesting enough, Symantec is the company that's dragging their feet the most to make this a requirement. The most progressive company in this is DigiCert. So if you're going to buy a certificate right now, I would recommend buying a DigiCert certificate. Vote with your feet. Show that you care about certificate transparency because they're going to be publishing their CT log very soon for all their certs. You can pin the certificates of privacy when you control both sides. So lots of companies build mobile apps. No need to use a public certificate authority. You can just publish your own certificate authority internally, or you can burn that key in on both sides, the serial number, the thumbprint of the key. So there's no need to trust anybody on the outside. Okay, I'm going to go a little faster, sorry. Interesting revelation, NIST backdoor to standard. So this is there's a thing that says, hey, yeah, we did a really good job. We backdoored a major cryptographic standard in 2006. So they don't say which one it is, but almost certainly what it means is dual EC DRBG. It's not PRNG. I have a typo here. This was a standard that NIST published as a requirement that you would have to support this pseudorandom number generator. It's a deterministic pseudorandom number generator that uses dual elliptic curve cryptography. At the time, people were like, why do we need this? This is super slow. It's kind of crazy and complex. 2007, Dan Shrummo and Niels Ferguson from Microsoft gave one of my favorite crypto talks. I wasn't there, but kind of retroactively, a 15-minute rump session at Crypto with this fantastic slide where they analyzed dual EC and they said, so what we're not saying is that this thing has a backdoor in it, but if the magic numbers in this standard happen to be points on a line on an elliptic curve, and then in that situation there is a backdoor. And now we can go and predict with only 30 bytes of pseudorandom of data from the PRNG, we can now predict the entire infinite data stream out of it, right? So I like how they're like, we're not saying there's a backdoor, but this thing's insane. What has come out recently is then has been known for a while is that the RSA Corporation publishes a commercial library called BSafe that you can use in your product so you can import secure crypto. They supported dual EC. Now, that by itself is not really that bad because if you wanted to be FIPS certified, you had to have it in your suite, right? You had to support it, although pretty much nobody's used it since the 2007. Anybody who's been paying attention has not used it. But what RSA did was make it the default way pseudorandom numbers were generated. So if somebody used the BSafe library, and they didn't really know what they're doing, which is kind of the definition of using the BSafe library, then they would be using this backdoored pseudorandom number generator. And Reuters has a story that I cannot confirm or deny, but Reuters has reported that's because the NSA had a contract with RSA to do that for $10 million, which is a small price for your reputation, but help somebody make his quota for 1 quarter, right? So I think this is actually probably the most damaging of all the NSA revelations. One of the reasons is the whole world operates on NIST standards, right? So the reason why you can go to a German website over HTTPS is because until this point, people have trusted the US government to be an honest broker in setting cryptographic standards so we can have interoperability around the world. AES, SHA-1, SHA-2, the upcoming SHA-3 standard, the most commonly used elliptic curves, and anything that's ever sold to the US government implement NIST standards. So without NIST, who do we trust? And most likely what's going to be is NISA, which is the EU's version of NIST, who already is like super happy because now people are going to have to read their stuff. They publish all this stuff that nobody reads, and now they're going to be forced to read in NISA documents. But this is going to be a huge pain for anybody who makes software or hardware because you're now going to have different standards for different parts of the world. The Russians already have a set of standards called GHOST that they require people to support, and so likely we're going to have 3 or 4. I wouldn't be shocked if the Chinese have their own too. So if you're selling a router or a VPN device, you might have to support 4 totally incompatible sets of ciphers, which I'm not sure then how you run a VPN between 2 offices in 2 different continents, right? I think one of the most interesting things here is this kind of demonstrates what the NSA's requirements for a backdoor are. So this was not a weakness, this was a real backdoor, right? So there's a lot of talk about how the NSA reduced the effective key size of DES back in the 70s from 56 bits to 40 bits, and that was a weakness. But that in doing that, they made DES weaker for anybody around the world, right? This was a backdoor that only the people that generated those magic numbers the first time would be able to exploit. And so I think that's interesting for looking forward. If you're afraid of that, then anything that has that kind of requirement, it can't just have a weakness that's put into it. It has to have some kind of super structured, complicated backdoor, which also hints for the strength of the elliptic curve discrete log problem, right? So ECCs only existed for like 30 years, so we don't collectively, the discrete log problem across primes has existed for like 500, right? Like you're using Fermat's little theorem. And so we have 500 years of mathematicians thinking about prime numbers in this way, but only 30 years of people looking at elliptic curves. So a lot of people are worried about it and like, oh, maybe there's an absolute problem with elliptic curve cryptography, but this points to not, because if the elliptic curve discrete log problem is weak, then this backdoor could be exploited by enemies of the NSA. So the NSA apparently does not have any knowledge, or they did not in 2007, that there's a basic weakness in EC DLP, which is great. I think that's actually a real positive outcome here. Do other standards that come out of NIST have a backdoor? So AES, most people think probably not. Anything in that kind of the way the symmetric algorithm works, a lot of people I've talked to think it would be very hard to have something in there that's a straight up backdoor. It would be a weakness that's exploitable everywhere. SHA-3 maybe, but probably not. The way the SHA-3 protocol hash was created was a pretty open process, and there's no real way for the NSA to mix with it. The ECCP curves maybe. So the standard ECC curves we all use curve parameters that were handed down from the mountain, from Mount Maryland. Now there is a document describing how those curves were created, but a lot of people are wondering, it's like, great, we took this magic number and then we ran it through a hash, and now we have a different magic number. And it's like, that seems a little, there's a layer of obfuscation there, but it seems like maybe a little too cute. So what do you have to do for this? First, you have to build your systems with crypto agility. Most systems are not built to be able to change out the crypto algorithms very easily. So TLS is a great example of crypto agility, where you have different packages of cipher suites that can be negotiated dynamically. You're going to have to look for supporting non-NIST standards. So the IETF now has drafts in place to support 3 protocols that were invented by Dan Bernstein, a elliptic curve signing an algorithm, a symmetric key, and a hash that's based upon AES. Chrome actually supports this already. So if you go right now in the Chrome dev version and you go to YouTube, you'll see that you're using Dan Bernstein's curves. Oh, no, I'm sorry. You're using Dan Bernstein's symmetric key and signing algorithm and hash algorithm. The curve can't be used because you can't buy a certificate that uses curve 25519 from anywhere. So it's a normal ECDSA P256 curve. But you're probably going to have to do that and get ready for NISA standards. So in a related, it turns out the NSA has also inserted products in the back door. This is from the classified budget that was leaked of the NSA's black budget, where they're like, this is why we need so much money. We need this money to insert vulnerabilities in commercial encryption systems and complete enabling. So enabling's the NSA term of art apparently for inserting vulnerabilities into something. A lot of people are trying to figure out what corporation name fits exactly into that gray box. This only came out a couple weeks ago, so I haven't had time to do too much work on this. But the absolute most interesting leak is the one that's just happened. When I talk about the media filter is starting to fall down a little bit because now we've got guys like Jake Applebaum, who is a security researcher, also wearing a journalist hat, and he's writing articles for Der Spiegel, but they're much more technical and interesting technical side. So Der Spiegel leaked this 2007 catalog of, this is the stuff you can buy from the internal store at the NSA of cool products that you can buy internally. And so this gives us a lot more technical detail about their capabilities. It was, yes. This is like, yes, Jacob Claus came and gave this to us. So if you look at here, for example, these are implants, which are, backdoor / rootkit / they use the term implant for multiple things that we would call different things. One here is for Dell servers. So they're talking about the ability to flash the system management module on Dell servers in a way that then even if you wipe the OS or change the BIOS out, the SMM is able to come in and repatch it for you. Here are physical and firmware persistence on Cisco equipment. If you look, close, what you'll see, Artemis is used to reflash the BIOS on target machine implant, yada yada. Implantation via interdiction. So that what we found out from this catalog is that the NSA is interdicting shipments. So if you buy a Cisco router and you're an NSA target, they will grab that from UPS or FedEx or whoever has it, and then modify it, wrap it back up, and then let it on its merry way.
Have people discussed the legal implications of this?
I have not heard anything. Again, this is pretty new, so I'm not sure. And I use UPS as an example. There's no indication of exactly where the interdiction's happening, so it could happen a lot of different places in the logistical supply chain. Obviously, if you're a big company, if you're Iranian government and you buy 100 Cisco routers, you're not getting them from UPS, right? There's a long supply chain there where this interdiction can happen. Yes, ma'am.
CIA has a really long history of working with companies and creating fake companies.
Yeah.
And CIA hasn't been talked about a lot in all of this stuff.
Yeah. CIA is almost mentioned nowhere here, which is interesting. Maybe it's what Snowden had access to. This might be just a demonstration of non-cooperation in the U.S. government, where the NSA is not sharing its toys with the CIA.
That's one of CIA's strengths, is working with companies.
Yeah, and it's quite possible maybe the CIA is doing the interdiction stuff. I'm not sure. It's not clear from here. This is really just a technical catalog. There's no data here about what they don't come up with an example. They're just talking about what they can do. When we say backdoor, there's two different kinds, right? So we could have a backdoor that's inserted in every single product that's shipped. So that seems to be what's hinted for from that budget document, is we spent money to weaken a specific product in a way that everybody has that weakness. And then there are basically, what we would normally call rootkits, but are much more complicated than rootkits, hardware backdoors or system management servers or firmware backdoors that are inserted into products on a targeted basis. So it's not surprising the NSA has custom exploits and rootkits. What is interesting is that they have a huge focus on physical access, that they're doing the interdiction of shipped products, and that they have firmware implants for lots of stuff. So they have Juniper, HP, basically any standard enterprise product line. In 2007, they had the products for. So now they probably even have a huge number more. Some more analysis here. If you're going to have a backdoor that's in everything, it's probably indistinguishable from a real bug, right? So if you're looking for this kind of stuff, I would look for things like timing leakage attacks. So there's been a lot of interesting research in the public literature over the last couple of years of looking at timing of doing a crypto handshake and what kind of stuff can you leak out, where some of these things might be a little too cute. Bad pseudorandom number generators, non-standard parameters in a handshake. So there are things that are standards that are required, but in certain types of crypto handshakes, you have numbers that are generated just for that one. And people use standard stuff like, 2 to the 16 minus 1 and such, but if you're using a non-standard thing, that might be an interesting hint. And then if something's just an exploit, probably an obscure memory management bug, right? Some kind of use after free bug that requires a really unlikely set of events to happen to set memory up correctly before the exploit happens. So what do you do if you're a company and you're worried about this? So the easiest thing is you don't buy products that never touch the United States, which is a very unfortunate outcome for Americans and for the American tech industry. If you are going to buy products from the US, then you probably want to buy them from the channel, right? So you don't want to, obviously the Iranian government's not calling up Cisco and having stuff drop shipped to them, right? They're already buying it through middlemen and such, but clearly there's probably a cat and mouse game here where certain governments are, building shell companies and such, and then the US are figuring out who their shell companies are and then interdicting the shipments. If you're really worried about this, then just buy your product from a place where it's indistinguishable from a bunch of them, right? So if you go into a Best Buy and you buy a laptop off the shelf, it's likely the NSA is not interdicted and inserted a backdoor into that, right?
Unless they've done it to all of them.
Sorry? No, off the website, yes.
No.
So if you go to Dell and you tell them it's me,
No, the one in Woodside. If I want to get all the VC information,
the one in Woodside, yeah. Right. This whole thing's interesting because actually in the last 5 years, the government has told us in the private industry to think a lot about our supply chain security, and now we know why they're talking about that. Because in the end, all this stuff flows through China, right? So like an Intel chip is probably made in the US or in Mexico, or in other places that Intel tightly controls, but then that package goes and gets put on a motherboard with a bunch of other stuff in China, and then it's shipped to a US manufacturer for final, if you look at the supply chain for this product, there's probably 12 companies in the world that could have a backdoor in it, right? I saw a guy I used to work with, Tim Newsham, who's very smart, said maybe the only solution for this is that future computer architectures are almost completely flat, where everything's done in software and you don't have, like this thing probably has 30 discrete CPUs, right? Do you know a Thunderbolt cable has a full ARM processor in it? That was one of our talks at Black Hat this summer. One of our guys put a backdoor into the Thunderbolt chip to do a DMA to take control of your machine over Thunderbolt, because the Thunderbolt cable you buy from Intel has a full ARM core in there with a little EEPROM to pull its operating system off of.
And the PCI access allows you to do directly.
Yeah, and PCI access, yeah, it's remoted PCIe, so you can just do bus mastering and take over the whole thing. And to be careful of PRNGs, so a great thing to backdoor would be a hardware pseudorandom number generator. There's some controversy on the Linux kernel list where now Linux, this over the protests of Linus Torvalds himself, is now mixing in some not as good entropy with the Intel RD-RAND instruction to prevent this kind of stuff. So some other stuff, NSA likes to spy on foreign leaders. The NSA likes to attack Tor, but they don't have a magic bullet. That was interesting because Tor uses 1024-bit RSA in some situations. And so there's a whole white paper on attacking Tor that does not have this is how we magically unwrap Tor. But there are a bunch of attacks against Tor. So if you think Tor is going to get you anywhere, I would doubt it. NSA loves to play with RF. So this is a thing that was called the Thing, which was a bug that was implanted in a seal of the United States that was hand-delivered to the American ambassador to Russia by smiling, singing Russian schoolchildren. Literally, were singing a song and handed it over to the Russian ambassador, to the U.S. ambassador, to decorate his office. It turned out embedded in it was a microphone with a long copper antenna that then. So obviously they took that and they're like, great, we're going to go put this in this Faraday cage right now. And they go and they scan it and stuff and it's not transmitting anything. They're like, great, well, there's no bug. Well, it turns out they didn't need to have any active electronics because then they beamed in a microwave beam from the outside off this antenna, and then the vibrations from the sound changed the antenna. Louis Thurman, the guy who invented the crazy sound, he's a Bulgarian, I think. He actually invented this for the Russians. He worked on this product. So it's a really cool thing. So the modern version of that is the NSA has a VGA cable where they have a tiny little antenna attached to the red line of the VGA cable where you can bounce an RF signal from outside on the VGA cable and then recreate what's on somebody's screen for that monitor, which is a pretty good upgrade. Now, this is interesting because there's some interesting memos internally where they're trying to estimate how much radiation has been absorbed by the people that worked in that office. And it's a somewhat terrifying amount. The Russians weren't that finely tuned or caring about the long-term reproductive health of the people who work in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. I would guess it looks like this is a much more targeted and tight beam. There's also exploitation of known mobile weaknesses. So we have 3 rogue base stations in our office, right? So we have the ability to interdict any GSM or CDMA phone call already. So it's not a surprise that the NSA has good off-the-shelf products to do this. But they're doing a lot of this. Interesting things we haven't seen though. No magic crypto, right? So there's no this is broken or we have a backdoor to this, or don't use RSA. None of that was in any of these documents that we've seen so far. No quantum computers, so nothing in here indicates that the NSA has a working quantum computer. In fact, there's a document that asked for money for development of a quantum computer. That doesn't mean they don't have it somewhere, but at least they're not admitting it to in their black budget that they have it. And very little discussion of the O-Day stuff. I mean, they talked about this malware, but there's very little about how they buy O-Days or what their stockpile looks like. So some general advice that we're giving to companies. You now need to include the NSA in your list of threat actors, right? So when you sit down, you design a new system or new data center or new office, the NSA is a threat actor that probably needs to be included. if you don't want to actually use the term NSA in your documentation, there are other things you can use. But it does make threat modeling a little more fun. Again, even if you're not worried about the NSA specifically, we now know that all of these techniques are doable. A lot of them, like I said, this is something we can do, right? Our company. So, if you for the NSA stuff, the stuff that doesn't require submarines or huge amount of physical access, most of that is probably available to normal attackers. And so using that in your threat model is probably going to help protect you against lots of people that you're not thinking about. If you're a business, this is really a business regulation issue. So, lobbying the U.S. government, all the major tech companies are doing that. They have a thing, a lobbying organization they've put together specifically on this topic. You're going to need to start to prepare transparency reports for non-U.S. regulators and consumers, which what you leave out is going to be very carefully parsed. So you got to be careful what you say and you don't say. I added this slide for you guys, especially for the undergrads in the room who are going to be looking for jobs at some point. This is a very complicated issue, the ethics of a technologist, of whether or not we have, some people believe technologists are just like any other normal job, that we have to, do our job and we have kind of our external moral frameworks, but we don't have any special responsibilities. Other people think that we are somewhat the technical priesthood of the 21st century and therefore have the same kind of requirements that doctors put on themselves, starting with the ancient Greeks and for years, right? So if you're a U.S. Army doctor, you are morally and ethically and legally compelled to provide services to your enemy, right? So you have a coworker who shoots somebody, and then it's your job to make him not die. And that's the kind of like moral imperative that medicine has. In the law, Bradley Manning had a lawyer who's a military lawyer who was, while Bradley Manning was being prosecuted by the U.S. government for treason, or not exactly treason, but something like treason, was ethically obligated to provide him with the best defense possible, right? And that's how our adversarial system works. And a lot of people think maybe in the technology side, we have some built-in requirements that are universal that are not just based upon the specific moral conundrum facing us at that moment. That's a very complicated issue. I gave a talk about it at DEF CON that you can find on YouTube. It's a hard one, but I'm hoping that people think about that. If you're an undergrad, think about if you're going to work at a company, what your output's going to do, right? There's a certain company with very nice offices on University Avenue that their product is used to spy on Americans, even though they deny it, but it is. A lot of Stanford grads go work there, and that's fine. I don't think that's immoral. I think their product's used for lots of immoral purpose, a lot of moral purposes. But you need to think very closely about your work product, what kind of effect you want it to have on the world. I don't think you can just ignore it and cash the check.
Are you talking about Palantir?
Yeah, I'm not going to say the name of any company.
Why are you giving the ethical concern just to the undergraduates? You think the rest of us have already got
You seem wise enough to make your own decision, sir. So with the future, we'll probably see more Snowdens. There's an interesting race for quantum computing and all this kind of stuff. It seems like the race is on, and it hasn't been won yet. Equivalent data gathering ability is actually in the hands of many, many private companies. People who host DNS handset makers and such. So again, the attack scenarios here are not just based, around the U.S. government. So, great. Thank you.